In the fall of 2018, a trail camera bolted to a cedar fence post on the southern boundary of a 160-acre parcel in LaFleur County, Oklahoma, recorded footage that the man who owned that camera has shown to exactly 4 people in the years since. The camera was a standard game unit, the kind deer hunters mount along travel corridors and food plots to pattern whitetail movement before the season opens. This one was positioned low, about chest height, aimed across a stretch of woven wire livestock fence where the property line runs along the edge of Ouachita National Forest land. The fence runs east to west through mixed shortleaf pine and post oak for about a quarter mile before it hits a creek draw and turns north. The camera triggered sometime after 2 in the morning on a night in late October. What it recorded was brief, and the infrared wash makes the details hard to resolve at first glance. But when you sit with it, when you look at it the way the owner has looked at it hundreds of times since that night, what the footage shows is something large and upright tangled in the top strands of the woven wire fence, struggling against wire that was cutting deeper with every movement. The shape of the head is wrong for anything that should be in those mountains. Elongated, canine, ears standing high and pointed against the ambient glow of the forest. A dogman, caught in a cattle fence on the south line of a man's property in the Ouachita Mountains of southeastern Oklahoma, trapped the way a deer gets tangled in a strand of barbed wire, except this was not a deer, and the fence was not barbed wire, and nothing about the proportions or the posture matched any animal in the Oklahoma Field Guide. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from, and if you've had an encounter like this. The man who owned that camera and that fence and that 160 acres agreed to talk to us on one condition: no real names. We will call him Lonnie. He spent the better part of 26 years working for the Oklahoma Department of Corrections at a state facility in Pittsburgh County. Retired in his late 50s. Bought the property south of the Kiamichi River in LaFleur County about 3 years before retirement, using savings and a small inheritance from his father's estate. The plan was straightforward: run a few head of cattle on the bottomland, keep the fences up, hunt the ridges in the fall, live out the rest of his years on a piece of ground where the nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the only sounds after dark were coyotes and owls, and the creek running over limestone in the draw behind the house. The property sits in the kind of country that people from other parts of Oklahoma do not fully appreciate until they have driven south of the Kiamichi River and watched the terrain change. North of the river, the land opens up, pasture and hay ground, and the broad valleys that run between the lower ridges. South of the river, especially south of Big Cedar, and into the drainage that feeds down from the winding Stair Mountains, the country closes in. The ridges get steeper, the hollows get deeper. Shortleaf pine and post oak and blackjack oak cover the slopes in a canopy thick enough that midday light hits the forest floor as a filtered green that makes the woods feel older and heavier than the elevation alone would suggest. These are the western Ouachita Mountains. The range runs from central Arkansas through the southeastern corner of Oklahoma, covering parts of McCurtain, Pushmataha, LaFleur, Latimer, Pittsburgh, and Atoka counties. The highest point in the Oklahoma portion is Rich Mountain, just under 3,000 feet, which you can reach by driving the Talamena Scenic Byway along State Highway 1 between Talahina and the Arkansas line. Below that ridge line, the terrain drops into drainages and creek bottoms and narrow valleys, where the forest is dense and the population is thin, and the nearest town of any size is Talahina, which has maybe 1,000 people, and not much reason to stop unless you are headed up the mountain or coming back down. Lonnie's property backed up to Ouachita National Forest on the south and east. The western boundary ran along a county section road that saw maybe 10 vehicles a day, most of them locals checking cattle or headed to a deer stand. The northern boundary followed a creek draw that eventually fed into the Kiamichi River system, a few miles downstream. The house was a 1970s ranch style that the previous owner had let deteriorate, and Lonnie spent the first 2 years of ownership replacing the roof, redoing the plumbing, and clearing brush from around the outbuildings. He ran about 30 head of mixed-breed cattle on the bottomland, and leased an additional 80 acres from a neighbor for winter grazing. The cattle operation was small, more hobby than business, but it kept him busy, and gave him a reason to walk the fence lines regularly, which is what a man who has spent 26 years inside institutional walls needs more than he realizes until he has it. The fence that matters in this story is the south line. Lonnie had replaced the original barbed wire with woven wire fencing in the spring of 2017, The year after he moved onto the property full-time, he ran it 4 feet high with 2 strands of barbed wire on top, which put the total fence height at about 4.5 feet. He set the posts on 8-foot centers, cedar posts that he cut from deadfall on his own property and peeled and sharpened, and drove with a post driver he borrowed from a man down the road. The fence ran along the national forest boundary for about a quarter-mile through mixed timber, crossed the creek draw on a homemade water gap, and turned north along the county road. Built to keep cattle in and feral hogs out, which in Lafleur County is a genuine concern because the wild pig population in the Ouachitas region has been expanding for years, and a sounder of hogs can destroy a hay meadow overnight. Lonnie walked that south fence line every 2 weeks, sometimes more often after storms when deadfall could take out a section of wire. He carried a fence tool, a bag of wire clips, and a pair of heavy leather gloves. He knew every post on that line. He knew where the ground was soft and the posts needed resetting after a hard rain.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the DOGMAN Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
He knew where a big red oak had dropped a limb across the top wire in August of 2017, and he had to splice in a new section. He knew the fence the way you know something you built with your own hands on your own ground, which is to say he knew it well enough that anything wrong with it registered immediately. The trail camera on the south fence had been there since late September of 2018. Lonnie ran 4 cameras on his property at any given time, all of them aimed at fence crossings or game trails where deer move between the national forest and his bottomland. The south fence camera was positioned to watch a spot where deer regularly jump the fence, about 200 yards east of the creek draw, in a section where the timber was thick on both sides, and a game trail cut through the post oaks on a slight diagonal from the forest land onto his property. He checked the cameras every week or two, pulling the SD cards, swapping batteries, and scrolling through the images on his laptop at the kitchen table. Most of what he got was deer, does, and fawns in the summer and early fall, bucks with hardened antlers by October, the occasional coyote trotting along the fence line at 3 in the morning, a bobcat once, sitting on a fence post like it owned the place, eyes burning white in the infrared flash, a black bear in September of 2017 that came through and never came back, probably a young male dispersing from the Ouachitas forest population to the south, standard Lafleur County wildlife, everything he expected to see. On the morning of October 29th, 2018, Lonnie pulled the SD card from the south fence camera and brought it inside. He made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and started scrolling. The camera had recorded 63 images and 4 short video clips over the previous 11 days. Most of them were deer. A few were triggered by wind moving the brush close to the lens, which is a common problem with trail cameras in windy terrain, and one that Lonnie dealt with by trimming back any vegetation within 6 feet of the camera face. The last video clip on the card was different from anything Lonnie had seen in over 2 years of running cameras on his property. The clip was recorded at 2:17 in the morning on October 27th. The camera was set to record 30-second video clips when the motion sensor triggered. The first few seconds showed the fence line in infrared, the woven wire glowing faintly in the camera's emitter wash, the cedar posts standing in a line that converged into the darkness of the timber on either side. Then, something entered the frame from the right. What Lonnie described to us, carefully, over 2 phone conversations that totaled about 6 hours, is this. A large shape, dark against the infrared glow of the background vegetation, appeared at the fence from the forest side. It was upright. It was moving with purpose, crossing toward the fence at an angle that suggested it was following the game trail that Lonnie knew ran through the post oaks on that side. When it reached the fence, it did not stop. It appeared to step over it, or attempt to step over it, the way a tall person might step over a low obstacle without breaking stride. Except the fence was 4.5 feet high with 2 strands of barbed wire on top, and whatever was crossing it miscalculated. The right leg, or what appeared to be the right rear leg if the creature had been on all 4s but was functioning as a leg in the upright posture, caught in the woven wire about 2/3 of the way up the fence. The horizontal wires of the woven mesh have openings that vary in size, larger near the top, smaller near the bottom. The leg went through one of the larger upper openings and then, as the body's momentum carried forward, the wire closed around it like a snare. The creature's weight pulled the fence down and sideways, which tightened the wire around the trapped limb. Within seconds, the creature was caught. One leg through the fence, the rest of the body on Lonnie's side, the wire cutting into what appeared to be the upper thigh or hip area. The camera recorded 22 more seconds of the struggle that followed. The creature struggled. It pulled against the wire with its body weight, which only tightened the entanglement. The fence posts on either side of the caught section bent toward each other under the force being applied. Lonnie estimated later that the two nearest cedar posts were each set about 2.5 feet deep in packed clay, and whatever was pulling against them was generating enough force to bow them visibly in the infrared footage. The creature reached back toward the trapped leg with what Lonnie described as a hand. He used the infrared resolution was not sharp enough to show fine detail, but the motion was distinct, a gripping, pulling motion directed at the wire around the leg, using an appendage that moved with articulation rather than the blunt sweeping of a paw. The clip ended after 30 seconds. The camera reset. 12 seconds later, the motion sensor triggered again and recorded a second 30-second clip. In this clip, the creature was still caught, still struggling. The pulling against the wire was less frantic now, more deliberate, as if it had shifted from panic to problem-solving. Lonnie could see the fence posts bowing further. He could see the woven wire stretching and deforming around the trapped limb, and he could see the creature's head turning toward the camera. In the infrared wash, the head was a dark mass against a slightly lighter background. The shape was elongated, the muzzle projected forward from the skull in a profile that was unmistakably canine. The ears were erect, pointed, set high and slightly forward on the top of the skull. The eyes, or what Lonnie interpreted as eyes, reflected the infrared emitter with a brightness that suggested a reflective layer behind the retina, the tapetum lucidum that allows nocturnal predators to see in low light. The eye shine was 2 points of white in the infrared, set forward on the skull the way a predator's eyes are set, binocular, forward-facing, designed for depth perception and tracking prey rather than the wide-set, lateral placement of a grazing animal. The creature looked at the camera for what Lonnie estimated was about 4 seconds. Then the clip ended. The camera reset again. But when the motion sensor should have triggered a third clip, it did not. The SD card showed no more recordings that night. When Lonnie retrieved the camera the following morning, the camera was still mounted on its post, still functioning, but the angle had been shifted. The lens was pointing about 15 degrees to the left of where Lonnie had aimed it, which meant something had pushed or bumped the camera on its mount hard enough to move it but not hard enough to knock it off the post. Lonnie sat at his kitchen table looking at those two clips for a long time. He played them on his laptop with the brightness turned up, pausing and restarting, trying to resolve details that the infrared resolution would not give him. He told us that his hands were not shaking. He told us that his heart rate did not spike. He told us that the feeling he experienced was not fear but recognition. He had spent 26 years working inside a maximum security correctional facility. He had dealt with riots. He had dealt with stabbings. He had restrained men who were bigger than him and stronger than him and wanted to hurt him. He knew what it felt like when his body went into crisis mode, and this was not that. This was something else. This was the slow, cold understanding that something was on his property that he could not explain, that the footage on his laptop showed something real, and that he was going to have to decide what to do about it. What he did was go check the fence. He drove his truck down the ranch road to the south pasture, parked at the gate, and walked the fence line east toward the camera position. It was about 10 in the morning, clear sky, temperature in the upper 40s, the kind of fall morning in the Ouachitas, when the air smells like pine resin and leaf mold, and the ridges to the south are sharp against the sky. He carried a fence tool and a flashlight, even though it was broad daylight, because the timber was thick enough along that section that the forest floor stayed in shade most of the day. He saw the damage from 50 yards out. 2 fence posts were bent toward each other at roughly 30-degree angles from vertical. The woven wire between them was stretched and deformed, pulled downward and outward as if something heavy had been trapped against it, and pulled hard enough to permanently distort the wire grid. Several horizontal wires were broken. The 2 strands of barbed wire on top had snapped and were hanging loose, curled back on themselves the way barbed wire does when it breaks under tension. The section of damaged fence was about 6 feet wide. Lonnie had built fences his entire adult life, first on his father's place in Pittsburgh County, and then on his own property, and he had never seen woven wire deformed like that by anything short of a vehicle or a full-grown bull running through it at speed. He crouched at the damaged section and looked at what was caught in the wire. Fur, dark brown, almost black, coarse and dense, caught in the twisted wire strands where the creature had struggled, not clumps of fur the way a deer leaves tufts when it jumps a barbed wire fence. Long strands, some of them 6 or 7 inches, pulled from the hide by the wire's grip. The fur was thicker and coarser than any animal hair Lonnie had handled. He had skinned deer. He had skinned coyotes. He had helped a neighbor skin a black bear once. The fur in his fence was different, heavier, oilier. It had a smell that he noticed before he was close enough to touch it. A dense, musky odor that was organic but unfamiliar. Not the sharp ammonia of coyote or the flat musk of whitetail, but something else. Something he did not have a reference for. There was blood on the wire. Not a lot. Smears on the horizontal strands where the wire had cut through the fur and into skin. The blood was dark, dried to a crust that had the reddish-brown color of old blood on metal. Lonnie touched it with his gloved finger and it flaked. He looked at the ground beneath the damaged section. The soil was disturbed. Leaf litter and pine needles scraped away, exposing the clay beneath, gouged by something digging for traction while it struggled against the fence. And in the exposed clay, partially filled with loose debris, he found tracks, 2 distinct impressions in the soft ground, each one roughly 7 inches long by about 5 inches wide. Canid in general shape, with 4 toe pads and what appeared to be claw marks at the front of each toe. The overall morphology was dog-like, but the scale was wrong. A large dog, a German Shepherd or a Rottweiler, leaves a track about 4 inches long. A gray wolf, which does not exist in Oklahoma's wild population, leaves a track around 4.5 inches. What Lonnie was looking at was substantially bigger than either one. The depth of the impressions told him the animal was heavy. The clay was packed and partially dried from a few days without rain, and the tracks were pushed into it a good 1.5 inches. That takes weight, real weight. He had tracked deer across the same ground, and their hooves barely dented it. He photographed everything: the damaged fence, the fur, the blood, the tracks. He used his phone, taking pictures from multiple angles, the way his training had taught him to document incidents. Then he went back to the truck, got a plastic bag, and collected a sample of the fur from the wire. He collected it carefully, pulling individual strands free of the twisted metal and placing them in the bag. He did not know what he was going to do with them. He collected them because collecting evidence was what you did when something happened that needed explaining, and 26 years in corrections had wired that instinct deep. He spent the next 2 hours walking the fence line in both directions from the damage point, looking for more sign. On the forest side, heading east, he found 3 more tracks in soft ground near the creek draw. These were different from the ones under the fence. They were spaced further apart, about 40 inches between impressions, and they were deeper in the toe area than the heel, consistent with a large animal moving fast, pushing off hard with each stride. The tracks headed downhill toward the creek and disappeared on the rocky ground near the water. On his side of the fence, heading west, he found scuff marks in the leaf litter, where a large body had moved through the post oaks at speed. Broken branches at about 6 feet off the ground, the fresh white of snapped wood visible against the bark. A sapling about 2 inches in diameter bent over and held down by a body that had pushed through it hard enough to crack the trunk without breaking it clean. The sapling was leaning at about 45 degrees, held in place by the remaining wood fibers, pointing in the direction the thing had traveled. West, toward the deep timber on the south side of his property, where the ridgeline climbed into the Ouachita National Forest, and the terrain got steep enough that nobody went back there unless they were hunting or lost. Lonnie fixed the fence that afternoon. He replaced the 2 bent posts, spliced in new woven wire, restrung the barbed wire. The work took about 3 hours, and he did it with his rifle leaning against the nearest standing post, loaded, safety off. He had not carried a weapon on his own property during daylight hours in the 2 years since he moved there full-time. The morning of October 29th, 2018, was the first time. He did not tell his wife about the footage or the fence. She lived on the property with him, but did not share his habit of checking trail cameras and walking fence lines. She managed the garden, kept the house, drove to Talahina for groceries, attended church on Sunday mornings at a small congregation off Highway 271. She knew about the cameras because Lonnie talked about the deer he was seeing, but she had no interest in scrolling through hundreds of infrared images of wildlife. Lonnie's decision not to tell her was not about protecting her from fear. It was about not having an explanation to offer. He could show her the footage and the photographs and the fur sample, and she would ask him what it was, and he would have to say he did not know, and the conversation would go somewhere that neither of them was ready for. Instead, he called a man named Travis. Travis ran cattle on a spread about 7 miles north of Lonnie's property, on the other side of the Kiamichi River. He was a few years younger than Lonnie, somewhere in his early 50s, born and raised in Lafleur County, and he knew the Ouachita country the way only a person who has spent their entire life in the same drainage can know it. His family had been in the county for 4 generations. His grandfather had logged shortleaf pine in the Winding Stair Mountains in the 1940s and 50s, when the timber industry was still the primary employer in southeastern Oklahoma, and the logging roads that thread through the national forest were cut by men with cross-cut saws and mule teams. Travis was a practical man, not a superstitious man, not a man who spent time on the internet reading about unusual things. He was a cattleman who got up before dawn, worked until dark, and went to bed early. Lonnie trusted him because Travis was the kind of person who looked at evidence and said what he thought without worrying about how it sounded. Lonnie drove to Travis's place that evening, sat at his kitchen table and showed him the trail camera footage on his laptop, showed him the photographs of the damaged fence, the fur, the blood, the tracks. Travis watched the footage twice without saying anything, looked at the photographs, picked up the plastic bag with the fur sample and held it up to the overhead light and turned it in his hands. Then he set it down and looked at Lonnie and asked if he had been drinking. Lonnie said he had not. Travis nodded. Then he said words that Lonnie has carried with him since that evening, because it was the first indication that what he had on his property was not unknown in Lafleur County. Travis said his grandfather had told him about things in the Winding Stair Mountains that the Choctaw people had names for, and that white people did not. Travis's family was not Choctaw, but they had lived in Choctaw country for over a century, and in a place like Lafleur County, where the Choctaw Nation has been the dominant cultural and political presence since the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek forced the removal of the Choctaw people from their homeland in Mississippi to Indian Territory in the early 1830s. You learn things from your neighbors that you do not learn anywhere else. Travis said his grandfather had worked alongside Choctaw loggers in the Winding Stair timber, and that those men had talked about beings in the deep hollows and the high ridges that you did not go looking for and did not talk about with outsiders. Travis did not remember the Choctaw word his grandfather had used. He said it sounded like it started with an N and was longer than most English words. He said his grandfather described the beings as tall, dark, and fast, with faces that looked like a dog's face pushed onto a frame that walked like a man. His grandfather said the old Choctaw loggers would not work certain hollows after dark, would not camp in certain areas even during the day, told the foreman the terrain was too steep or the timber was too small, any excuse to avoid going where they knew the beings lived. Travis told Lonnie he did not know if the stories were true. He said he had never seen anything himself. He said the mountains south of the Kiamichi were full of things that most people never encountered, because most people stayed on the roads and the trails and the managed portions of the national forest and never went deep enough into the backcountry to find what was there. He said Lonnie's property sat at the edge of one of the most remote drainages in Lafleur County, where the ridgelines climbed into the Winding Stair, and the forest had not been commercially logged in decades, and the only human traffic was the occasional deer hunter who walked in from a national forest road and walked back out before dark. He said if those things from his grandfather's stories were real, Lonnie's property was exactly the kind of place where you would find them. At the edge, at the boundary between the world people lived in and the world that belonged to whatever was up in those mountains. Travis told Lonnie one more thing before Lonnie drove home that night. He told him to fix the fence, keep his mouth shut, and see what happened. He said if whatever was in that footage was living in the national forest behind Lonnie's property, it had been there a long time. And it had been there without bothering anyone, and the worst thing Lonnie could do was draw attention to it. He said attention would bring people with guns and cameras, and the kind of curiosity that gets somebody hurt. He said fix the fence, keep the cameras running, and watch. Lonnie went home and did exactly that. He fixed the fence, which he had already done. He repositioned the trail camera, aiming it at the same section but pulling it back about 10 feet to get a wider field of view. He added a second camera on a tree about 50 yards east of the first one, covering the game trail approach from the national forest side, and he waited. November of 2018 produced nothing. The cameras recorded deer, coyotes, a single gray fox, and a raccoon that kept triggering the motion sensor by climbing the fence post the camera was mounted on. December was the same. Deer season came and went. Lonnie hunted his own property for whitetail, sitting in a stand on the north side of the bottomland, where the timber opened up into a hardwood flat that deer used as a transition zone between bedding and feeding areas. He killed a decent 8-point buck on the second Saturday of rifle season and processed it in the barn the way he did every year. He did not hunt the south side. He did not walk the ridgeline above the damaged fence section. He did not go into the timber on the national forest boundary after the encounter. That was a change, and he knew it. Before the footage, Lonnie had walked those ridges regularly. He liked the solitude. He liked the physical effort of climbing the steep ground through the shortleaf pine, where the carpet of fallen needles was thick and soft, and the air smelled like turpentine, and the views from the ridgetop looked south across miles of unbroken forest toward the Kiamichi Mountains. After the footage, he stopped going. He did not decide to stop. He simply did not go. The same way you stop taking a particular road after you learn it floods in heavy rain. Or the same way you stop leaving your garage door open after your neighbor gets robbed. Your behavior adjusts to accommodate information your conscious mind has not fully processed. The forest south of his fence line was no longer empty country. Something lived there, and his body knew it, even when his rational mind was still trying to file the footage under unexplained wildlife encounter and move on. January of 2019. A hard month in the Ouachitas. Ice storms moved through southeastern Oklahoma twice in the first 3 weeks, coating the trees with a half-inch of clear ice that turned the forest into a crystalline version of itself, and then brought branches and whole trees crashing down under the weight. Lonnie lost power for 4 days during the second storm. He ran his generator, kept the cattle fed and watered, cleared deadfall from the ranch road with a chainsaw, and checked his fences after each storm for ice damage. The south fence had taken a hit. A large post oak on the national forest side had dropped a major limb across the wire, smashing 2 posts flat and taking down about 30 feet of fence. Standard storm damage. He cleared the limb with the chainsaw, pulled the wire off the broken posts, and planned to repair the section when the ground thawed enough to drive new posts. While he was working on the downed section, he noticed something on a standing post about 40 yards west of the damage. The post was a cedar, one of the ones he had cut and peeled and driven himself. It had been scratched, deep vertical gouges running from about 4 feet off the ground to just over 6 feet, 4 parallel marks, evenly spaced, each gouge about a 1/4 inch wide and deep enough to cut through the bark and into the pale wood beneath. The exposed wood was fresh. The resin was still wet and sticky to the touch, which in January cold meant the marks were recent, probably within the last few days. Lonnie had seen bear claw marks on trees. Black bears in the Ouachita region mark trees regularly, standing on their hind legs and raking the bark with their front claws. The marks are typically 5 claw widths, matching the 5 digits of a bear's front paw, and they top out at about 5.5 feet on a large male, which is the maximum standing reach of the biggest black bears in Oklahoma. What Lonnie was looking at was 4 marks, not 5, and they went to 6 feet. Higher than any black bear in Oklahoma could reach. The spacing between the individual gouges was wider than bear claw marks too, about 2.5 inches between marks, which would correspond to a hand considerably larger than a black bear's front paw. He photographed the marks. He measured them with his fence tool, using the handle as a rough scale. He looked at the ground around the post, but the ice and thaw cycle had destroyed any tracks that might have been there. He stood in the gray January light, looking at those marks on his fence post, and felt the same slow, cold recognition he had felt at the kitchen table, looking at the trail camera footage 3 months earlier. Something had marked his fence post the way a predator marks the boundary of its territory. The marks were deliberate, controlled, applied with force and precision by an appendage that had 4 fingers with claws capable of cutting cedar to a depth of a 1/4 inch. Over the next several weeks, as the ice melted and the ground softened, and the Ouachita winter eased into the false spring that southeastern Oklahoma gets in late February before the real cold comes back in March, Lonnie found more marks. 6 additional fence posts along the south line, each one bearing the same 4-claw vertical gouges, each set at the same height range, from roughly 4 feet to 6 feet, or slightly above. The marked posts were not random. They were spaced at intervals that corresponded to the high points along the fence line. the spots where the fence crested small rises in the terrain and was visible from the greatest distance. An animal walking the fence line from either direction would see the marked posts before it saw the unmarked ones. Lonnie recognized the pattern because it was the same logic he would have used if he were posting signs along a boundary. You put the signs where they will be seen first. He mapped them, stood at each marked post and took a GPS reading with a handheld unit he had used for marking tree stands and property corners. Plotted the readings on a county plat map he had pinned to the wall of his shop. The marked posts formed a line that corresponded almost exactly to the southern boundary of his property where it bordered the national forest. The marks were not on the national forest side. They were on his side, on his posts. The creature had not marked the forest boundary. It had marked his fence. That distinction mattered to Lonnie, and it took him a while to articulate why. The creature was not claiming the national forest. The national forest was its territory already, had been for however long these things had been in the Ouachitas, which, based on Travis's account of his grandfather's stories and the Choctaw traditions that Travis had heard fragments of, was a very long time. The creature did not need to mark the forest. The forest was home. What it was marking was the boundary between its territory and Lonnie's, the fence line, the edge, the place where one domain ended and another began. And the marks were on Lonnie's posts, which meant the creature understood that the fence belonged to the human. It was marking the human's boundary markers, reinforcing the line, saying in the only language available to it that this is where your ground starts and my ground ends, and I know the difference. Lonnie thought about that for a long time. He thought about it while he repaired the storm-damaged fence section and reset the posts and restrung the wire. He thought about it while he fed cattle and checked water and did the daily work that keeps a small ranch running in the Ouachita Hills. He thought about it at night when he sat on the back porch in the dark and listened to the forest to the south and heard the coyotes and the owls and, twice, something else. A vocalization that came from the ridgeline above the south fence line, carried downhill on the cold air with a clarity that open terrain in winter provides. A sound that was lower than a coyote's howl and more structured than a dog's bark. A sound with tonal variation that rose and fell in a pattern that repeated before it stopped. Lonnie heard it at about 9:30 one night, and again around 11 the following week. Both times, the coyotes that usually called from the creek draw went silent when the sound came from the ridge. Both times, the silence lasted longer than the vocalization itself, as if the coyotes were waiting for something to finish before they resumed their own noise. In March of 2019, Lonnie found the first deer, a whitetail buck, a young spike, lying at the base of a marked fence post on the south line. The deer was dead. Its neck was broken, the head twisted at an angle that was wrong in the way that violence is wrong, rotated past the point where bone and muscle and tendon should stop. The throat had been opened by jaws that tore through the hide and the muscle beneath in a single wound, exposing the trachea and the major blood vessels. The wound was not ragged the way a coyote kill is ragged, with multiple bites and tears from a pack working together. It was a single, powerful laceration, as if a mouth with enormous jaw strength had bitten down and pulled once, and that was enough. The deer had been placed there. Lonnie was certain of that. The carcass was lying against the base of the marked fence post, positioned parallel to the fence line, with its head pointing west and its legs tucked under it, as if it had been arranged after death. Wild kills do not look like that. A coyote pack drags a carcass to pieces and leaves bones and fur scattered across a wide area. A bear drags a kill to a secluded spot and covers it with brush and leaves to cache it for later feeding. This deer was neither scattered nor cached. It was displayed, placed at the base of a territorial marker, like an offering or a demonstration or a statement that Lonnie could not translate, but could not ignore. He photographed the carcass. He examined the wound with the detached attention of a man who had spent over 2 decades in an environment where violence was part of the daily landscape, and the ability to observe without reacting was a survival skill. The bite radius, measured from the edges of the wound, was wider than any canine jaw Lonnie had ever seen. A large dog, a mastiff or a shepherd, has a bite span of about 3 to 4 inches. What killed this deer had a bite span of closer to 6 inches, based on the width of the laceration. The depth of the puncture wounds at the edges of the tear, where the canine teeth had driven through hide and muscle, suggested teeth that were over 1 inch long and thick enough to crush through the tracheal cartilage. He buried the deer, dug a hole with the tractor bucket about 50 yards from the fence line, dropped the carcass in, and covered it. He did not call the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. He did not call the county sheriff. He did not tell his wife. He told Travis during a phone call that night. And Travis listened without interrupting, and then said words that Lonnie had been thinking but had not put into words. Travis said whatever had left that deer was telling Lonnie two things at once. It was saying, "I can do this," and it was saying, "I am choosing not to do it to you." Spring came to the Ouachitas, the way spring always comes, with red buds blooming pink along the creek draws, and dogwood opening white in the understory, and the grass greening up in the bottomland pastures, and the cattle slicking off their winter coats, and the whole country coming alive after the Seymour hard months. Lonnie calved out his small herd in late March and early April, which is a time that demands attention and sleep deprivation and constant vigilance because newborn calves are vulnerable to everything, coyotes and weather, and their own mothers lying on them, and a dozen other threats that a small-scale cattleman deals with every spring. He spent nights in the barn with the heifers that were calving for the first time, checking on them every 2 hours, pulling a calf when one presented breech, doctoring navels with iodine, making sure the new calves nursed within the first hour. Standard ranching work. The kind of work that occupies your mind completely and pushes everything else to the margins. During calving season, something happened that Lonnie did not immediately connect to the footage and the fence marks and the dead deer. His coyote problem disappeared. Every cattleman in the Ouachita region deals with coyotes during calving season. Coyotes in southeastern Oklahoma are larger than their western cousins, often running 50 or 60 pounds, and they are smart enough to target newborn calves in the first hours of life, when the calf is wet and weak and the mother is exhausted from delivery. Lonnie had lost a calf to coyotes in the spring of 2017, his first full year on the property. He had lost another in 2018. Both times, the calf was taken from the pasture nearest the south fence line, which was closest to the national forest and the cover that coyotes used to approach undetected. In the spring of 2019, he did not lose a single calf. More than that, he did not hear coyotes on the south side of his property. The coyotes that had yipped and howled from the creek draw every night for 2 years went silent. Not gradually, abruptly. Lonnie noticed it in late March, during the first week of calving, when he was sitting in the barn at 2 in the morning waiting for a heifer to finish dilating, and he realized that the night was quiet, in a way it had never been before. No coyotes from the south, coyotes from the north, from across the Kiamichi River bottom, faint and distant, calling the way they always did, but from the south, from the direction of his fence line and the national forest beyond it, silence, complete and absolute. He mentioned it to Travis. Travis said the coyotes on his property were as loud as ever, maybe louder than usual. Travis's place was 7 miles north, well away from the mountains, on open pasture ground where the terrain was flatter and the forest cover was thinner. His coyote population had not changed. Lonnie's had. The coyotes had not left the region. They had left Lonnie's property. Something had pushed them off. By May, Lonnie started to connect what was happening into a pattern that he could see, even if he could not fully explain it. The trail camera footage in October, the territorial marks on his fence posts in January and February, the dead deer in March, the absence of coyotes during calving season. Each event, taken individually, could be given a conventional explanation. A large feral dog tangled in the fence, a bear marking territory, a cougar killing a deer and leaving it, coyotes shifting their range due to prey availability or pack dynamics. Each explanation was plausible on its own. Together, they were insufficient. They did not account for the trail camera footage that showed a figure upright, with a canine head and articulated hands. They did not account for 4-claw marks at 6 feet on fence posts. They did not account for a deer placed at the base of a territorial marker with a bite radius wider than any known predator in Oklahoma. And they did not account for the feeling that Lonnie had every time he walked the south fence line, the feeling of being observed by an observer, comfortable with his presence, but was watching him with an attention that had purpose behind it. In June of 2019, the hottest month Lonnie had experienced on the property, with temperatures breaking 100 degrees for 9 consecutive days, and the creek in the draw dropping to a trickle, Lonnie found what he described as the most disturbing sign he had encountered since the trail camera footage. He was walking the east section of the south fence, checking for heat damage to the wire tension, when he noticed that the trail camera on the game trail approach had been moved. The camera was mounted on a post oak about 5 feet off the ground, strapped to the trunk with a ratchet strap and a padlock that secured the camera housing to prevent theft. The camera was still mounted, the strap was still tight, the padlock was still locked, but the camera was pointing at the sky. Someone or something had gripped the camera housing and rotated it upward on the strap until the lens pointed straight up instead of across the game trail. The strap had not been loosened. The camera had been rotated within the strap the way you would rotate a jar inside a towel wrapped around it, turning the object inside its restraint without removing the restraint. That took grip strength and manual dexterity. It took understanding that the camera was the important part, and the strap was the thing holding it in place. It took the cognitive step of recognizing that you could defeat the camera's function without removing the camera from the tree, simply by changing where it pointed. A bear would have ripped the camera off the tree, strap and all, or ignored it entirely. A curious raccoon might have chewed on the housing but would not have rotated it with precision. What moved that camera understood what it was and what it did, and figured out the most efficient way to neutralize it without triggering a response from the person who put it there. Lonnie stared at the camera for a long time. He reached up and rotated it back into position. He tightened the strap. He checked the SD card. The last recording on the card was from 2 nights earlier, a 30-second clip triggered at 1:44 in the morning. The clip showed the game trail in infrared for about 8 seconds. Then a dark shape rose from below the camera, filling the frame from the bottom up. For a fraction of a second, the infrared wash resolved what appeared to be a hand reaching toward the lens, broad palm, long fingers, a grip that was closing. Then the image swung upward and the camera was looking at stars and the tops of trees and nothing else. The card had recorded nothing since because the camera was aimed at the sky, where there was no motion to trigger the sensor except wind-moved branches. The hand. Lonnie told us about the hand on our second phone call, and his voice changed when he described it. Got quieter, more precise. He said the infrared did not show perfect detail, but what he could see was an appendage that was larger than a human hand by a significant margin. The palm was broad, wider than his own palm, and the fingers were long and thick and appeared to taper toward the tips rather than maintaining uniform thickness the way human fingers do. He said he could see the separation between the fingers, 4 of them, with the suggestion of a 5th that might have been a thumb positioned at an angle consistent with opposition, which is to say the hand could grip, could wrap around an object and squeeze, could rotate a trail camera on its strap with enough precision to change its orientation without breaking anything. He said that was the detail that ended any remaining possibility of a conventional explanation. Bears do not have articulated hands. Dogs do not have hands at all. What left that infrared impression on his trail camera was something with primate-level manual dexterity attached to a body that the rest of the footage showed was canine in head shape and predatory in build. The combination did not exist in any zoological classification he could find, and he looked. He spent 3 nights on his laptop after that, searching for anything that matched what he was seeing. Large canids, unknown primates, misidentified bears, feral humans. He searched every possibility he could think of and none of them fit. The closest match he found, the only thing that lined up with the totality of what he had documented since October, was DOGMAN. He did not use that word himself, not at first. He found it online, in forums and YouTube channels and research sites that documented encounters matching what he was experiencing. The descriptions matched: bipedal, canine head, massive build, dark fur, nocturnal, territorial, intelligent. The behavioral profiles matched too: territorial marking, camera awareness, deliberate avoidance of direct confrontation with humans, the depositing of killed prey at boundary markers, the ability to clear coyotes and other predators from an area through what appeared to be territorial dominance rather than predation. All of it matched. The word DOGMAN gave him a framework for what he was dealing with, and having a framework, having a name, was better than the formless dread of not knowing what category of impossible he was looking at. Through the summer and fall of 2019, Lonnie settled into a pattern that he described to us as coexistence, though he acknowledged that was a generous word for a situation in which one party was a retired corrections officer on a fixed income, and the other party was a predator, capable of tearing a fence apart with its hands and break a deer's neck with a single bite. The coexistence looked like this. Lonnie worked his property during the day. He ran cattle, He mowed pasture. He cut firewood. He maintained fences. He lived his life on 160 acres in the Ouachita foothills and did everything a man does on a small ranch in rural Oklahoma. And at night, a presence moved along his south fence line that he could hear sometimes and see on trail cameras occasionally and find evidence of regularly. The territorial marks continued. Every few weeks, Lonnie would find fresh gouges on a fence post or, increasingly, on trees near the fence line. The marks were always the same, 4 parallel vertical scratches, starting at about 4 feet and running up to 6 feet or slightly above. Always 4, always vertical, always deep enough to cut through bark and into wood. He found them on his cedar fence posts, on post oaks along the property boundary, on a large shortleaf pine that stood about 30 yards inside his property on a small knoll that overlooked the south pasture. That pine was the highest point on the south side of his land, a natural vantage point from which you could see the house, the barn, the bottomland pasture, and the county road to the west. The marks on that tree went higher than any of the others, up to about 7 feet, as if whatever made them was standing at its full height and reaching as high as it could. Lonnie measured the pine tree marks carefully. The individual claw gouges were about 3/8 of an inch wide, cut through the bark to a depth of about 1/4 inch. The spacing between the 4 marks was approximately 2.5 inches. He compared these measurements to published data on black bear claw marks in the Ouachita region, which he had found through the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation's online resources. Black bear claw marks in Oklahoma typically show 5 claw widths, averaging about 1.5 inches between marks, with individual gouges about 1/4 inch wide. The marks on Lonnie's trees showed 4 claw widths at 2.5 inches apart, with wider individual gouges. The math did not work for a bear. The anatomy did not work for a bear. Whatever was marking his trees had a hand that was wider than a bear's paw, with 1 fewer digit, and could reach almost 2 feet higher than the tallest black bear in the state. The game camera manipulation continued as well. Over the course of 2019, Lonnie lost 3 trail cameras to destruction and had 4 more rotated on their mounts the same way the first one had been turned. The destroyed cameras were found on the ground beneath the trees they had been mounted on. Housings cracked, straps torn. The mounting brackets on 2 of them were bent in ways that suggested tremendous grip force applied to a small metal component. The rotated cameras were found pointing upward, aimed at the canopy or the sky. Still mounted, still strapped, still locked, but functionally blinded. The creature had figured out that rotating the camera was more effective than destroying it, because a destroyed camera might be replaced quickly, while a rotated camera might go unnoticed for days, recording nothing useful while the motion sensor triggered on wind-moved branches above. Lonnie tried concealment. He wrapped cameras in burlap and moss. He mounted them inside hollow tree sections. He positioned them higher, at 8 and 10 feet, using climbing sticks to reach the mounting height. The concealed cameras lasted longer. The higher cameras lasted longest, but eventually, all of them were found. The burlap-wrapped cameras were pulled from their trees, the wrapping torn off, the cameras destroyed. The hollow tree cameras were found when the creature apparently reached inside the hollow and pulled them out. The high-mounted cameras were found last, sometimes lasting weeks before being rotated or pulled down. The creature was patient. It checked. It patrolled. It found new cameras the way a warden finds illegal traps, by walking a route regularly and noting anything that changed. The intelligence demonstrated by the camera response bothered Lonnie more than the physical evidence of the creature's size and power. Size and power are dangerous but understandable. Every large predator has them. Intelligence of this kind, the ability to identify a surveillance device, understand its function, and defeat it through the most efficient available method, that was different. That was a cognitive capacity that the wildlife management framework Lonnie had grown up with simply did not account for. Bears are smart. Coyotes are smart. Neither one systematically patrols a territory to locate and neutralize camera equipment while leaving the rest of the human infrastructure untouched. The creature on Lonnie's property was not reacting to cameras as novel objects. It was identifying them as a specific category of threat, tools that record and could lead to discovery, and treating them differently from fence posts and trees and buildings and vehicles, and every other human-made object on the property. The distinction was precise. The creature marked fence posts, but did not destroy them. It marked trees, but did not damage them beyond the territorial gouges. It did not approach the house. It did not disturb the barn or the outbuildings. It did not bother the cattle. It did not interfere with Lonnie's truck, or his tractor, or his chainsaw, or any of the equipment he used on the property. The only human-made objects it consistently targeted were the cameras. The cameras were the threat. The cameras were the thing that could document what the creature looked like, and where it lived, and how it behaved. And the creature understood that. And it responded to that specific threat, while leaving everything else alone. If you have spent any time in the Ouachita Mountains of southeastern Oklahoma, if you have hunted the ridges south of the Kiamichi River, or fished the creek bottoms in the National Forest, or driven the Talamina Scenic Byway along Highway 1, and looked out at the miles of unbroken forest rolling south toward the Utsis, Kiamichi Mountains, you know the kind of country I am talking about. You know how empty it is once you get off the pavement. You know how fast the terrain gets steep and the forest gets thick, and the nearest other human being gets far away. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything out of the ordinary happen in that part of the state, because the reports I have been pulling together from the LaFleur County drainage over the past year suggest that Lonnie's experience is part of a larger pattern of activity in the southeastern Oklahoma Ouachitas that goes back further than most people realize. By the fall of 2019, a full year after the initial trail camera footage, Lonnie had accumulated a body of evidence that he kept in a locked filing cabinet in his shop. SD cards, photographs, fur samples, GPS coordinates plotted on a county plat map, and a notebook with dated entries recording every observation. He was running a documentation program on his own land, using skills he had developed over 2 decades in corrections. The documentation was thorough, dated, and specific, and it was completely useless in any institutional sense, because there was no institution in Oklahoma that had a procedure for receiving a report of an unidentified bipedal canid, marking fence posts, and neutralizing trail cameras on private land in LaFleur County. The Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation manages black bears, white-tailed deer, wild turkey, bobcat, coyote, and a growing population of mountain lion in the southeastern part of the state. The department's predator reporting system has categories for each of these species. There is no category for DOGMAN. There is no form. There is no field in the database. If Lonnie had called the Wildlife Department's district office in McAlester and described what his cameras had recorded and what his fence posts showed, the conversation would have ended one of 2 ways. Either the officer on the phone would have told him he was looking at a bear and suggested he contact a nuisance wildlife trapper, or the officer would have gone quiet the way Travis went quiet, and Lonnie would have known that the person on the other end had heard this before and was choosing not to engage with it. Either way, no report would have been filed, no investigation would have been opened. The encounter would have been absorbed by a system that had no mechanism for processing it and no incentive for trying. In November of 2019, something happened that changed the dynamic between Lonnie and the creature on his property, something that the title of this video references directly, and that Lonnie described to us as the worst and most important night of his life on that land. November 14th, 2019. A Thursday night. Temperature dropping through the low 30s. Clear sky. No moon. Lonnie was in the house watching television around 9:30 when his dogs started barking. He had 2 dogs, a blue heeler named Jake and a mixed breed hound that he kept as a companion for the heeler. Both dogs slept on the covered porch on the south side of the house, which faced the bottomland pasture and, beyond it, the south fence line and the national forest. The dogs barked at coyotes regularly. They barked at raccoons, possums, armadillos, and the occasional owl that landed on the barn roof. Lonnie had learned to distinguish the barks. Coyote barks were excited, high-pitched, sustained. Raccoon barks were shorter, more annoyed than alarmed. What he heard that night was different from both. The dogs were barking in a register that was lower than their usual alert, and the barks were broken by pauses in which the dogs whined. Lonnie had heard that whine once before, during a thunderstorm that dropped a bolt of lightning close enough to the house to leave a burn mark on the utility pole in the driveway. It was a fierce sound. The dogs were afraid. Lonnie muted the television and listened. Between the dogs' barks, he heard something from the direction of the south fence line, a sound that was not coyotes, and was not wind, and was not any mechanical noise he could attribute to equipment or vehicles. It was a vocalization, and it was close. Closer than the ridge, closer than the fence line, in the pasture. The low, oscillating tone that he had heard twice from the ridge line in January and February But now it was coming from maybe 200 yards from the house, from the dark pasture between the barn and the south fence, and it was louder and more sustained than anything he had heard before. The dogs stopped barking. That was the detail that moved Lonnie from the couch to the gun cabinet. Dogs that are afraid bark louder. Dogs that stop barking entirely have gone past fear into the kind of paralysis that prey animals experience when a predator is close enough that making noise will get them killed. Lonnie opened the gun cabinet, took out his deer rifle, a bolt-action in .270 caliber that he kept loaded with the safety on, and walked to the back door. He did not turn on the porch light. 26 years in corrections had taught him that when you respond to an incident in the dark, you do not announce yourself with a light that turns you into a target and blinds you to everything beyond the light's reach. He opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The dogs were under the porch bench, pressed against the house wall, silent. He could feel their bodies trembling against his boots. He stood in the dark and let his eyes adjust. The pasture was a field of dark shapes, the cattle standing or lying in the grass, their white faces faintly visible against the dark ground. The barn was a black rectangle to the left. Beyond the pasture, the tree line of the south fence was a solid dark wall against the slightly lighter sky. The stars were bright. No moon, the kind of darkness that rural Oklahoma produces on a clear November night. Deep enough that you can see the Milky Way, but not deep enough to hide a large shape standing in an open pasture if you know where to look. Lonnie saw it. About 150 yards out, standing in the pasture between two groups of cattle, there was a shape that was taller than the cattle, and was not a cow. It was upright. It was motionless. The starlight was just enough to give Lonnie the silhouette, and the silhouette was wrong in every way. That a silhouette can be wrong when you have spent your life around livestock and wildlife and people, and you know the shape of every one of them against a night sky. The shoulders were too wide. The head was too high. The proportions of the torso and the arms were wrong for a human being, the arms hanging too long, the torso too deep through the chest, and the head. The profile of the head against the stars showed a muzzle extending forward from the skull and ears standing erect on top. It was in his pasture, between his cattle, 150 yards from his house. Lonnie raised the rifle. He put the scope to his eye and tried to find the shape in the crosshairs. His scope was a standard 3 to 9 power variable, good for deer at 200 yards in daylight, marginal in darkness even with a clear sky. He could see the shape in the scope, dark against dark, no detail, just the outline, upright, massive, motionless, facing him. He could not tell if it was looking at him. He could not see the eyes, but the body was oriented toward the house, toward the porch where he was standing, and it was not moving. Lonnie held the crosshairs on the shape for what he estimated was 10 seconds. His finger was on the trigger. The safety was off. He told us that in those 10 seconds he thought about several things simultaneously. He thought about what would happen if he fired and hit it, and it did not go down. He thought about what would happen if he fired and missed, and the sound brought it toward him instead of away. He thought about what would happen if he fired and killed it, and had to explain the body to his wife and the sheriff and the wildlife department and every person in LaFleur County who would come to look at the thing he had shot in his pasture. He thought about the fact that it was standing between his cattle and none of the cattle were panicking, which meant either the cattle did not perceive it as a threat, or they had frozen the way prey freezes when a predator is so dominant that flight is pointless. He thought about the dead deer at the base of his fence post, the one with the broken neck and the single devastating bite wound, and he thought about the fact that the creature had placed that deer there as what Travis had called a message. I can do this. I am choosing not to do it to you. He lowered the rifle, did not fire, stood on his porch in the dark with a loaded weapon and a shaking body, and watched the shape in his pasture for another 30 seconds that felt like the rest of his life compressed into half a minute. Then, the shape moved. It turned. The silhouette shifted from a front-facing profile to a side profile, and he could see the muzzle clearly against the sky, the long line of the snout extending forward from the skull, the ears standing sharp and pointed, and then it moved away from the house, toward the south fence line, at a walk, not a run. A walk, smooth and ground-covering and unhurried, the walk of an animal leaving because it has finished what it came to do, not because it has been frightened away. It reached the tree line and disappeared into the dark. Lonnie stood on the porch for another 20 minutes. The dogs did not come out from under the bench. The cattle did not move. The pasture was empty and silent, and the stars turned overhead, and Lonnie's hands shook against the stock of the rifle until the cold and the adrenaline dump made his fingers too stiff to hold the grip properly. And he went inside and locked the door and sat at the kitchen table with the rifle across his knees until the sky turned gray in the east. His wife found him there at 6 in the morning. She asked what had happened. He told her a coyote had been in the pasture, and he had gone out to run it off. She accepted this because it was plausible, and because she had no reason to believe her husband of 30 years was lying to her about an event in their own backyard. He ate breakfast. He fed the dogs. He went out and checked the cattle. All present, none injured, none behaving abnormally. Whatever had been in the pasture had not touched them. He walked the pasture to where he had seen the shape standing. The ground was hard, November grass, dried and brittle, not ideal for tracks, but in a low spot where rainwater collected and the soil stayed softer, he found an impression. One clear track, 7 inches long, 4 toe pads with claw marks, pressed deep into the damp earth by something heavy. The track pointed south, toward the fence line. He photographed it, added the GPS coordinates to his map, added the date and the description to his notebook. Then he stood in his pasture in the November morning sunlight and looked at the south tree line and said something out loud that he had never said before. He said, "I know you are there." December brought the event that changed everything. The event that gives this video its title. On December 8th, 2019, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, the motion-activated security light on the south side of Lonnie's barn switched on. The light was a high-wattage flood mounted under the eaves, aimed at the area between the barn and the south pasture gate. Lonnie had installed it after the November encounter, along with a second security camera that he mounted under the barn eaves, higher than the trail cameras, aimed at the fence line approach. The security camera was a hardwired unit connected to a DVR in the house, not a battery-powered trail camera. Lonnie reasoned that a hardwired camera mounted at 12 feet under a metal roof, connected by cable to a recorder inside the house, would be harder for the creature to find and neutralize than a standalone trail camera strapped to a tree at 5 feet. The barn light woke him up. The light was bright enough to cast shadows through the bedroom window on the south side of the house. He was out of bed and at the window in the time it took his heart to shift from sleeping to fully awake, which after November was about 2 seconds. Through the window, he could see the south pasture gate, the fence line beyond it, and the near edge of the tree line. The floodlight illuminated maybe 100 yards of ground. Beyond that was darkness. At the fence line, approximately 80 yards from the barn, the security light was reflecting off something in the wire. Movement. Something was moving at the fence, and the motion was wrong. It was lateral, side to side, the movement of something trapped against a horizontal structure and pulling against it. Lonnie grabbed his rifle and a flashlight and went out the back door. The dogs were under the porch again, pressed against the wall, silent and trembling. He crossed the yard, opened the pasture gate, and walked toward the fence line with the flashlight beam aimed at the ground in front of his feet. He did not point the flashlight at the fence. He did not want to blind himself, and he did not want to illuminate whatever was there until he was close enough to see what he was dealing with. He walked through the pasture grass with the rifle in his right hand and the flashlight in his left, pointed down, and the security light behind him throwing his shadow 50 yards ahead of his body. At about 40 yards from the fence, he stopped. He could hear it. Heavy breathing. Not human breathing and not the panting of a dog. A deep, bellows-like respiration that sounded labored, like something large working hard against a restraint. Mixed with the breathing, a lower sound, a rumbling that came from the chest or the throat. Not a growl in the aggressive sense, but a sound of distress, the kind of noise that a large animal makes when it is in pain and cannot escape the source of the pain. He raised the flashlight and pointed it at the fence. What the beam showed him is what he described to us in the most careful and measured language of any part of our conversations. He told us he stood there with the flashlight aimed at the fence for approximately 3 seconds before he processed what he was seeing, and during those 3 seconds, his brain went through every possible interpretation of the image in front of him and rejected all of them except the one that was true. The creature was caught in the fence, tangled the same way it had been tangled in the October 2018 trail camera footage, but worse. This time, it had apparently attempted to cross the fence at a section where Lonnie had reinforced the woven wire with an additional strand of smooth wire threaded through the mesh to increase rigidity. The creature's left leg was through the woven wire about 2/3 of the way up the fence, the same way it had been caught before. but the smooth wire reinforcement had looped around the limb above what Lonnie described as the knee joint, creating a snare effect that tightened as the creature pulled. The harder it pulled, the tighter the wire cinched. The wire was cutting into the leg. Lonnie could see dark blood on the wire and on the fur around the entanglement point. The creature was on its side, half on Lonnie's side of the fence and half on the forest side, with the trapped leg suspended in the wire at an angle that pulled the limb away from the body. The body was enormous. Lonnie estimated the torso length at roughly 5 feet from shoulder to hip, with legs that added another 2.5 to 3 feet, putting the total height at somewhere around 7.5 feet if it were standing upright. The shoulders were massive, layered with muscle that was visible even through the dense dark fur that covered the body. The arms were long, longer than a human's arms would be on a body that size, with forearms that were thick and ended in hands. Hands, not paws. Broad, heavy hands with 4 fingers and a thumb. The fingers tipped with dark claws that had been digging into the ground as the creature tried to pull itself free. The head was turned toward Lonnie. In the flashlight beam, at 40 yards, the face of the creature was the most detailed view Lonnie had ever gotten, and it was the detail that would stay with him through everything that followed. The head was canine. There was no ambiguity about that. The muzzle extended forward from the skull 6 or 7 inches, ending in a broad nose that was dark and wet. The upper lip was pulled back from the teeth in a grimace of pain or exertion, and Lonnie could see the teeth. Upper canines that were thick and curved and over an inch long, a row of incisors between the canines, premolars visible behind the canines where the lip pulled back. The jaw was heavy, wide, the jaw of an animal built for crushing force. The eyes were set forward on the skull, amber in the flashlight beam, catching the light and reflecting it back with the same tapetum lucidum glow that Lonnie had seen on the trail camera. The eyes were looking at him with an expression that he struggled to describe. He said it was not rage, it was not fear, or if there was fear, it was buried under something else. He said the closest word he could find was awareness. The creature was aware of him, aware of the flashlight, aware of the rifle, aware of its own situation, trapped in wire, bleeding, exposed, at the mercy of a human with a weapon who had every reason to be afraid of it and none to help it. The eyes communicated something that Lonnie received not through language, but through the direct transmission that passes between two living things when one of them is helpless and both of them know it. Lonnie stood there for what he estimated was 15 seconds. The creature did not vocalize. It did not growl. It did not snap or lunge. It lay on the ground with its leg caught in the wire and its body twisted, and its head turned toward the man with the flashlight and the rifle, and it breathed those deep, bellows-like breaths, and it watched him. He had a decision to make. The decision took him about 10 seconds, and he has thought about those 10 seconds every day since. He could go back to the house, get in his truck, drive to Talihina, and call the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation from the first place he found with cell service. He could describe what he had on his fence and wait for someone to come out and deal with it. The response would take hours. By then, the creature would have either freed itself, leaving a destroyed fence section and a trail of blood into the national forest, or it would have exhausted itself, fighting the wire and died from blood loss or stress, or the simple biological collapse that happens when a large animal spends hours trapped in a position that compromises its circulation, breathing. He could shoot it. The rifle was loaded. The safety was off. 40 yards, standing still, broadside if he stepped to the right for a better angle. A clean kill shot on an animal that size at that range was well within his capability. He had killed deer at twice that distance in worse light. He could end it, end the mystery, end the fear, end the late-night vocalizations, and the turned cameras, and the marks on his fence posts, and the dead deer at the base of his territorial markers. One trigger pull, and it would all be over, and he would have a body, and the body would prove everything and destroy everything simultaneously. Or he could cut it loose. Lonnie went back to the barn. He set the rifle against the wall inside the door. He picked up his fence tool and a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, the kind used for cutting welded wire mesh and smooth wire under tension. He put on his heaviest leather gloves, the ones he used for handling barbed wire. He took a deep breath that he felt in his teeth, and he walked back to the fence. The creature watched him come. It had not moved. The bleeding appeared to have slowed, either because the wire had cut as deep as it was going to cut, or because the blood was clotting around the wound. The breathing was still heavy, but the distress sound had diminished. The amber eyes tracked Lonnie as he approached, and when he got within about 15 feet, the creature made a sound, a low rumble from deep in the chest that was not a growl and not a warning, but something Lonnie interpreted as acknowledgement, recognition, the same sound, or close to it, that Lonnie's blue heeler made when Lonnie came into the barn at night to check on a calving heifer, and the dog heard his boots on the concrete and rumbled that low note that meant, "I know who you are." Lonnie stopped at the edge of the entanglement. The creature's trapped leg was suspended in the wire about 3 feet off the ground, stretched tight by the snare effect of the smooth reinforcement wire. The woven mesh had deformed around the limb, cutting into the fur and skin in a band about 4 inches wide. The reinforcement wire was buried in the fur above the knee joint, cinched tight enough that Lonnie could see the flesh bulging on either side of the wire. Cutting that wire was going to require him to put his hands within inches of the creature's leg, within reach of those claws, within striking distance of jaws that could crush a deer's trachea with a single bite. He knelt beside the fence. He set the fence tool down. He held the wire cutters in his right hand. He looked at the creature. The creature looked at him. The amber eyes were about 6 feet from his face, and at that distance, in the barnlight spill, he could see them clearly. They were not the eyes of an animal in the way that a dog's eyes are the eyes of an animal. There was something behind them that he described as old, deep, a looking at you that was not the flat regard of a predator measuring prey, but the steady gaze of something that was weighing him, assessing him, deciding something about him that he would not know the outcome of until the wires were cut and the creature was free to act on its decision. Lonnie reached for the first wire, the reinforcement wire, the one buried in the creature's leg. He positioned the cutters on the wire about 3 inches from where it entered the fur. He could feel the tension in the wire through the tool handles, the stored energy of a large animal's weight pulling against a thin strand of steel. When he cut this wire, the tension would release, and the limb would drop and the creature would have one leg free. What it did after that was out of his hands. He squeezed the cutters. The wire snapped with a sound like a guitar string breaking. The creature's leg dropped about 6 inches as the snare released. The creature flinched, a full-body flinch that rippled through its frame, the way a horse flinches when a fly bites. But it did not pull away. It did not lash out. It lay still and watched Lonnie with those amber eyes and waited. Lonnie cut the next wire, a horizontal strand of the woven mesh that was twisted around the leg below the knee. The wire cutters bit through it and the strand sprang loose. The creature's leg moved slightly, testing the freedom. Still caught. More wire. Lonnie worked methodically, cutting one wire at a time, pulling the cut ends away from the leg, working from the top of the entanglement toward the bottom. Each cut released a little more of the trapped limb. Each cut brought his hands closer to the creature's body. He could feel the heat coming off the animal's leg, a furnace heat that radiated through the leather gloves and told him the creature's body temperature was higher than any dog or bear he had ever been near. He could smell it, that dense, musky odor he had noticed on the fur sample from the October fence damage, but now it was concentrated and close and mixed with the metallic scent of blood. He cut 7 wires. The 7th cut freed the leg entirely. The creature pulled the limb back through the gap in the fence and drew it against its body, tucking it under the way a dog tucks an injured paw. Lonnie stayed kneeling at the fence, wire cutters in his hand, watching. The creature lay on the ground for maybe 10 seconds, breathing hard, the freed leg pulled tight against its torso. Then, it moved. It pushed itself up. Not to standing, not immediately. It rose to what Lonnie described as a crouch, weight on the right leg and both hands. The injured left leg held off the ground. The crouch put the creature's head about 4 feet above the ground, about level with Lonnie's head where he was kneeling. They were face to face, 6 feet apart. The creature's breath was visible in the cold December air, gusting from the nostrils in rhythmic clouds. Lonnie could see the teeth, the canines, the incisors, the jaw that could crush bone. He could see the hands planted on the ground, the claws digging into the clay, the fingers spread wide for stability. He could see the muscle in the shoulders and the chest, defined even under the fur, the architecture of something built for power in ways that went beyond any animal he had encountered in 50-plus years of living in Oklahoma. The creature looked at him, at 6 feet, in the light from the barn, for what Lonnie estimated was 5 or 6 seconds, though he acknowledged that his sense of time in that moment was compromised by the adrenaline in his system. Then it made a A single, low vocalization that started in the chest and came out through the throat and the nasal passages simultaneously, producing a harmonic that Lonnie felt in his breastbone. It was not a growl. It was not a bark. It was not a whine. It was a sound he had never heard before and has never heard since. And when he described it to us, he paused for a long time before saying it sounded like the word was thank you in a language that does not use words. The creature stood, full height. The injured leg took weight, but the creature favored it, shifting most of the load to the right side. Standing, it was taller than Lonnie had estimated from the pasture sighting. He was kneeling, which compressed his perspective, but even accounting for that, the creature was massive. The head was above the top of the nearest fence post, which put it well over 6 feet. The shoulders were broader than any man Lonnie had ever worked with, and he had worked with some large men in the corrections system. The arms hung down past the thighs, the hands at a level that would have been mid-shin on a human of the same height. The legs had a forward bend at the knee that was more pronounced than human anatomy, a digitigrade stance that put the heel off the ground and the weight on the ball of the foot and the toes, like a dog's hind legs scaled up to support something that weighed 350 pounds or more. It turned away from him, turned toward the national forest, and it walked into the tree line on the south side of the fence, favoring the left leg, moving through the post oaks and into the shortleaf pine at a pace that was slow by its standards, but fast enough that within 30 seconds it was gone, absorbed by the forest, disappeared into the darkness on the south side of the fence line as completely as if it had never been there. Lonnie stayed kneeling at the fence for a long time after the creature was gone. His knees were wet from the cold ground. His hands were shaking inside the leather gloves, not from cold. The wire cutters were still in his right hand, the jaws streaked with blood that was not his. He looked at the cut section of fence, the loose wires hanging, the blood and fur still caught in the mesh. He looked at the ground where the creature had crouched, the deep impressions of its hands and its feet in the clay. He looked at the tree line where it had disappeared. Then he stood up, walked back to the barn, put the wire cutters on the workbench, picked up his rifle, and went inside the house. He locked the doors. He sat at the kitchen table. He did not sleep. In the morning, he went out and examined the fence section in daylight. The damage was significant. He would need to replace about 8 feet of woven wire and 1 fence post that the creature's weight had pushed out of plumb. The blood on the wire was dried dark. The fur was still caught in the twisted strands. He collected more samples, put them in a bag, and added them to the filing cabinet in his shop. He photographed the cut wires, the blood, the impressions in the ground. He checked the security camera under the barn eaves. The camera had recorded. The hardwired unit under the metal roof, mounted at 12 feet, connected by cable to the DVR inside the house, had captured the entire event. 80 yards of distance, and the barn light's limited throw made the details soft, but the footage showed a clear sequence. The creature approaching the fence, the entanglement, the struggle, the barn light triggering, Lonnie coming out of the house, Lonnie approaching the fence, the cutting, the creature rising, the creature standing, the creature walking into the forest. All of it recorded on a DVR that the creature could not reach because it was inside the house, connected to a camera it could not find because it was mounted under the eaves of a metal building at a height that would require a ladder. Lonnie sat in the house and watched the footage 3 times. Then he called Travis. Travis came over that afternoon and watched the footage twice. Travis sat in silence through both viewings. When the second viewing ended, Travis leaned back in his chair and looked at Lonnie and said 2 words. Holy Lord. Then Travis said words that reframed everything Lonnie was experiencing. Travis said Lonnie had just done something that nobody in the history of whatever this phenomenon is had ever done before. He had helped one. He had cut a dogman out of a wire fence while it lay on the ground and looked at him and let him do it. Travis said he did not know what that would mean, but he was certain it would carry meaning, because an animal that intelligent does not forget something like that. The creature would remember what Lonnie did. The creature would remember who Lonnie was, and whatever relationship existed between a man and a territorial predator that had been marking his fence line for a year. That relationship had just changed in a way that neither of them could predict. Travis was right. The relationship changed, but it did not change in the way either of them expected. In the weeks following the December cutting, the territorial marks on Lonnie's fence posts stopped. The marks on the trees stopped. The cameras that Lonnie had running on the property were not touched. For the first time since October of 2018, Lonnie's trail cameras recorded footage without being rotated or destroyed. The cameras caught deer, coyotes at a distance moving along the far side of the south fence rather than crossing onto the property. A bobcat, squirrels, turkeys, standard wildlife. No large bipedal shapes in the infrared. Lonnie thought the creature had left. He thought the injury, the entanglement, the exposure to the barn light and the close proximity to a human with a weapon had been enough to push it out of the area. He thought the territorial marking had stopped because the territory was abandoned. He told Travis he thought the dogman was gone. Travis said wait. In late January of 2020, Lonnie found new marks. But they were not on his fence posts. They were on trees outside his property, across the south fence line, on the National Forest side, on shortleaf pines and post oaks that stood within 50 yards of his boundary. The marks were the same, 4 parallel vertical gouges, deep and fresh, running from about 4 feet to well above 6 feet on each marked tree. Lonnie counted 9 marked trees in a line that paralleled his south fence for the full quarter-mile length of the boundary. He walked the forest side of the fence with binoculars and spotted more marks further back, on trees that stood along a ridge about 100 yards south of the fence. The marks were everywhere. Dozens of trees, freshly gouged, creating a wall of territorial indicators on the forest side of Lonnie's property that was more extensive and more deliberately placed than anything the creature had put on his fence posts. The creature had not left. It had adjusted. It had stopped marking Lonnie's property and started marking the forest around his property. The territorial boundary was no longer on Lonnie's fence. It was beyond Lonnie's fence, pushed back into the forest, creating a buffer zone between the creature's core territory and the human's land. A buffer that had not existed before December. A buffer that appeared after Lonnie cut the creature free. The implications of that shift took Lonnie weeks to fully process. And when he described them to us, his voice was careful in the way that a person's voice gets when they are saying something they know sounds impossible, but they have lived with long enough to be certain of. The creature had changed its territorial behavior in response to what Lonnie did. Before the cutting, the creature marked the boundary between its territory and Lonnie's, placing signs on both sides of the line, asserting dominance over the border the way a territorial predator asserts its claim. After the cutting, the creature pulled its markings back. It removed the claim on Lonnie's posts and trees and established a new boundary further out, in the forest, creating a demilitarized zone between its domain and the human who had freed it from a wire fence in the dark. Lonnie did not use the phrase, demilitarized zone. Travis did, and the term stuck because it was accurate. The zone between Lonnie's fence and the new line of marked trees in the national forest was territory that neither party claimed. The creature did not mark it. Lonnie did not develop it. The cattle did not graze it because it was on the other side of the fence. The deer moved through it freely. The turkeys roosted in the oaks within it. It was a neutral strip, and its existence was the creature's doing. What happened to the predator population on and around Lonnie's property in the months that followed is the part of this story that his neighbor Travis confirmed independently, and that remains, in Lonnie's assessment, the most practically significant consequence of the December encounter. The coyotes did not come back. Not to Lonnie's property. The spring of 2020 was the second calving season since the coyote silence began, and for the second consecutive year, Lonnie did not lose a single calf. His calving pasture was on the south side of the property, the pasture closest to the fence line and the national forest. In any previous year, that would have been the most vulnerable location on the ranch. Coyotes used the forest edge for cover, approaching the calving pasture from the south under the tree canopy, picking off newborns in the first hours of life when the calves were weak and the mothers were tired. In 2020, no coyotes came from the south. Lonnie heard them from the north and the west, from across the Kiamichi River bottom, and from the county roadside, faint and distant. From the south, from the direction of the marked trees and the creature's territory, silence. Travis, whose property was 7 miles north, continued to lose calves to coyotes every spring. So did the ranchers on either side of Travis. The LaFleur County coyote population was healthy, aggressive, and well-fed on livestock losses across the county. The coyotes had not been reduced. They had been excluded from one specific piece of ground, from the 160 acres that Lonnie owned and the buffer zone that the creature maintained around it. The coyotes were not stupid. They knew what lived in those woods on the south side of Lonnie's fence, and they knew that going there was suicide. A territorial predator that could break a deer's neck with one bite and deposit the carcass at a boundary marker as a statement was not something a 50-pound coyote was going to challenge. The black bear activity on Lonnie's property declined as well. In 2017 and 2018, Lonnie had documented regular bear sign on the south side, overturned rocks, torn apart rotting logs, scat on the game trails. Bears from the Ouachita population moved through his property seasonally, following the mast crop in the fall and the berry growth in the spring. After the spring of 2020, the bear sign on the south side of the property virtually disappeared. Lonnie still found bear sign on the north side, near the creek draw and the county road, where bears crossed between forest patches. But the south side, the side that bordered the creature's territory, was clean. Bears had been pushed off the same way the coyotes had been pushed off, by the mere presence of something at the top of the hierarchy. Not by predation, not by violence, by territorial dominance so complete that every other predator in the area recognized it and adjusted its behavior accordingly. Lonnie's cattle grazed on the south pasture and were not bothered. His dogs eventually stopped trembling when they heard sounds from the south at night, though they never barked at the south fence line again. His trail cameras recorded normal wildlife footage. His fences stayed intact. His property existed in a state of calm that no other piece of ground in the area enjoyed, a calm enforced by a presence in the national forest on the other side of the fence, and maintained a buffer zone that kept predators out, with an effectiveness that no electric fence, no guardian dog, no wildlife management program could match. He was protected. That is the word Lonnie used, and it is the word that makes this story different from any other dogman encounter I have come across in years of researching this phenomenon. He was protected. The dogman that had spent a year marking his fence posts and neutralizing his cameras and depositing killed deer at his boundary markers and standing in his pasture at night had, after the night Lonnie cut it out of his fence, shifted its posture from territorial assertion over his property to territorial protection of his property. The fence posts were no longer marked because the creature no longer needed to assert dominance over the boundary. The cameras were no longer touched because the creature no longer needed to neutralize the human's surveillance. The boundary had been renegotiated, the terms had changed, and the new terms, the terms that emerged from whatever calculation the creature made after a human knelt beside it in the dark and cut it free when it could have shot it or left it to die. The new terms were favorable. Lonnie did not romanticize this. He said so explicitly, and he said it more than once. He said the creature was not his pet. It was not his friend. It was not grateful in the way that a dog is grateful when you feed it or rescue it from a shelter. The creature was a territorial intelligence that had adjusted its behavior based on a transaction. Lonnie provided something of value, the creature's freedom, and possibly its life. And the creature responded with something of value in return, the protection of Lonnie's property from predators and the cessation of territorial challenges. It was an exchange, a negotiation conducted without language, governed by a logic that was alien but internally consistent. The creature understood exchange, it understood debt, and it honored both. Travis called it a treaty, a word he used half joking and half serious, the way people use humor to approach things that are too large to discuss with a straight face. He said Lonnie had negotiated a treaty with a dogman, and the terms of the treaty were simple. Lonnie left the forest alone. The creature left Lonnie's property alone. The fence was the border. The marked trees were the enforcement mechanism, and the buffer zone between them was the space where neither party trespassed. By the fall of 2020, the arrangement had been in place for nearly a year. The pattern was consistent. No predator incursions on Lonnie's south pasture. No camera interference. No new marks on his posts or trees. The marks in the national forest were refreshed periodically. Lonnie could see fresh gouges on the trees nearest his fence when he walked the boundary with binoculars. The creature was still there, still maintaining its territory, still enforcing the buffer, still present in the forest on the other side of the fence, which Lonnie knew because he could hear the vocalizations on quiet nights, that low, oscillating tone rising from the ridgeline to the south, sometimes joined by a second voice from a different direction, suggesting more than one individual. In October of 2020, almost exactly 2 years after the initial trail camera footage that started everything, Lonnie had a second visual sighting that confirmed the creature's continued presence and provided him with information that reframed the entire experience. He was sitting on his back porch at dusk, watching the sun go down behind the ridgeline to the west when movement at the south fence line caught his eye. He picked up his binoculars and focused on the fence about 200 yards out, near the spot where the December cutting had happened. Two shapes were standing at the fence line, on the forest side, partially screened by the post oaks, but visible enough in the fading light to resolve their silhouettes. Both were upright, both were large. One was noticeably larger than the other, taller and broader through the shoulders, standing perhaps a head and a half above the shorter one. The shorter one stood closer to the fence, almost touching the woven wire, and the larger one stood behind and to the side. Lonnie watched them for about 30 seconds through the binoculars. The light was going. Details were soft, but he could see the head shapes, the muzzles, the ears. He could see the difference in size between the two and recognize it as the difference between an adult and a younger animal, or between a male and a female, or both. Two dogmen standing at his fence line at dusk, looking across the pasture toward his house, standing there the way you stand at a neighbor's fence when you want to see who is home without knocking on the door. They did not cross the fence. They did not vocalize. They stood there for maybe a minute, then turned and walked back into the forest together, the larger one falling in behind the shorter one as they moved into the trees. Lonnie watched the tree line until it was too dark to see. Then he went inside. He called Travis that night and told him what he had seen. Travis listened and then asked the question that Lonnie had been thinking about since the sighting, but had not been willing to say out loud. Travis asked if the smaller one might have been the one Lonnie cut out of the fence. Lonnie said he did not know. He said the creature he had cut free was large, but in the dark, in the stress of the moment, he could not be certain of its exact size relative to the one he had seen in the pasture in November, or the shapes he was now seeing at the fence. The smaller shape could have been the same individual. It could have been a mate. It could have been a juvenile. He could not tell. What he could tell was that there were two of them, at least two. The vocalizations he had heard from the ridge, sometimes from two directions simultaneously, suggested as much. The trail camera footage from October 2018 had shown a single individual in the fence. The November pasture sighting had been a single individual, but the dusk sighting in October 2020 showed a pair. Two individuals maintaining territory together on the south side of his property, in the Ouachita National Forest, in the ridgeline timber above the Kiamichi River drainage. A pair means a breeding population. A breeding population means permanence. The dogman presence on the south side of Lonnie's property was not a transient individual passing through. It was an established territory, held by at least two animals that were present year-round, marking boundaries, enforcing a buffer zone, maintaining the arrangement that had emerged from the night Lonnie knelt in the dark and cut 7 wires. The Choctaw cultural context for what Lonnie was experiencing runs deep in Leflore County, deeper than most outsiders realize. The Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma has been the dominant political and cultural presence in southeastern Oklahoma since the forced removal of the Choctaw people from Mississippi in the early 1830s. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830 ceded the remaining Choctaw homeland east of the Mississippi to the United States in exchange for territory in what is now southeastern Oklahoma. The Choctaw people walked the Trail of Tears to Indian Territory and established a nation that has endured for nearly 2 centuries. Today, the Choctaw Nation is the 3rd largest tribe in the United States, with more than 200,000 enrolled members and a reservation that encompasses 10.5 counties in southeastern Oklahoma, including Leflore County. Within Choctaw oral tradition, the forests and mountains of the southeastern Oklahoma homeland are inhabited by beings that predate the Choctaw presence in the region. The Nalusafalaya, whose name translates roughly to long black being, is described in traditional accounts collected by anthropologists, including David Bushnell, in the early 1900s, as a tall, humanoid figure with a shriveled face, small eyes, and long pointed ears. Bushnell recorded the account of Pisatuntema, an elder and daughter of a Choctaw chief in Louisiana, who described the Nalusafalaya as resembling a man in size, inhabiting the densest woods near swamps, and frightening hunters who encountered it in the late afternoon when the shadows grew long beneath the pine trees. The tradition describes the being as one that approaches humans not with predatory intent but with an interest in transferring power or influencing behavior. a complex figure that is neither purely threatening nor purely benign. The Nalusa Falaya is not the same as the Dogman. The traditional descriptions do not specifically reference canine features, and the cultural context of Choctaw spirit beings operates within a spiritual framework that is distinct from the biological framing that Dogman researchers use. What is relevant is not the specific morphology described in the traditions, but the underlying recognition that the forests of southeastern Oklahoma are home to beings that are large, bipedal, intelligent, territorial, and old. Beings that the Choctaw people knew about and maintained relationships with long before European settlement, long before the forced removal, long before the National Forest was established, and the logging roads were cut, and the Talimena Scenic Byway was paved along the ridgeline. Travis's account of his grandfather's conversations with Choctaw loggers in the Winding Stair Mountains supports this continuity. The loggers who refused to work certain hollows, who avoided specific areas that they described as belonging to something else, were maintaining a traditional knowledge system that recognized the presence of territorial beings in the forest and responded with avoidance and respect, rather than investigation or confrontation. That is the Choctaw approach. You know what lives in the deep hollows. You leave it alone. You do not discuss it with outsiders. You maintain boundaries that are ecological and spiritual simultaneously, boundaries that have been in place for centuries and that serve the survival of both parties, the human community and the beings in the forest. Lonnie, unknowingly and without any cultural framework for what he was doing, had stumbled into a version of that relationship. He had established boundaries with a territorial intelligence in the Ouachita forest. He had maintained those boundaries through an exchange of behavior that both parties could interpret, and he was living within an arrangement that the Choctaw people of southeastern Oklahoma might have recognized immediately as an ancient and familiar pattern of coexistence, the human and the forest being maintaining a fence between them, each respecting the other's territory, each understanding that the arrangement works only as long as both sides honor the terms. Linda Godfrey spent 3 decades documenting dogman encounters across the United States, and her research identified behavioral patterns that hold remarkably consistent across geography and time. Nocturnal activity, territorial marking, camera awareness and avoidance, coordinated movement, suggesting social organization, deliberate restraint in encounters with humans, association with waterways and ridgeline terrain. The encounters Lonnie documented on his property in Leflore County match every one of these patterns. The territorial marking, the camera neutralization, the restraint demonstrated on the night the creature stood in the pasture and chose to walk away rather than approach the house, the association with the Kiamichi River drainage and the ridgelines of the Ouachita National Forest, the evidence of coordinated activity suggested by paired vocalizations and the dusk sighting of 2 individuals. The geographic pattern is significant. The Ouachita Mountains run from central Arkansas into southeastern Oklahoma, covering millions of acres of national forest and private timberland, much of it with population densities below 10 people per square mile. The Kiamichi River drainage alone encompasses over 1,800 square miles of terrain, much of it roadless or accessible only by logging roads that are maintained sporadically and used primarily during hunting season. The upper Kiamichi River Wilderness, established by Congress in 1988, covers nearly 10,000 acres of designated wilderness adjacent to the Winding Stair Mountains and the ridgeline terrain where Travis's grandfather heard the Choctaw loggers' stories about beings in the hollows. This is big, empty, steep, forested country with limited human access and almost no population south of the Kiamichi River between the mountain towns and the Arkansas line. If a large, intelligent, nocturnal predator were going to establish a territory in the continental United States and avoid detection for decades or centuries, this is exactly the kind of terrain where it would do it. The 1887 lumberjack encounter in Wexford County, Michigan, which is considered the first modern dogman sighting in the documented record, occurred in terrain that shares structural similarities with the Oklahoma Ouachitas: forested, remote, hilly, sparsely populated, connected by waterways and ridgelines to vast tracts of unbroken wilderness. The pattern holds from Michigan to Wisconsin to Pennsylvania to Kentucky, and now to southeastern Oklahoma. Dogman encounters cluster in terrain that provides cover, water, prey, and distance from dense human settlement. The Ouachita Mountains of Leflore County provide all 4 in abundance. What happened to Lonnie in the years after the December 2019 cutting is a story about what it means to carry knowledge that reorganizes your understanding of the world and that you cannot share without consequences. He did not tell his wife until the spring of 2021, over 2 years after the initial trail camera footage, 15 months after the night he cut the creature from his fence, and only after she found the locked filing cabinet in his shop while looking for a spare padlock key and asked him what was in it. He showed her everything. The footage, the photographs, the fur samples, the map with the GPS coordinates, the notebook with the dated entries. She sat in the shop and went through it methodically, the way she approached everything, which was with patience and thoroughness. She watched the trail camera footage from October 2018. She watched the security camera footage from December 2019. She looked at the photographs of the territorial marks and the deer carcass and the tracks. She read sections of the notebook. She held the bag of fur up to the light the way Travis had held it. And then she looked at Lonnie and asked him why he had not told her. He said he did not know how. He said he was afraid she would think he was losing his mind. The way you lose your mind after 26 years in corrections, the way people sometimes come apart after retirement, when the structure that held them together is gone, and the long hours and the empty land give their demons room to move. He said he was afraid she would call one of their grown children, and the children would come to the property and insist on taking him to see a doctor, and the doctor would prescribe medication, and the medication would make him slower and duller, and less himself. He said he was more afraid of that than he was of the thing in the forest. He said the thing in the forest had never hurt him. The possibility of losing his family's trust was worse than anything with claws and teeth. His wife listened to all of this. Then she said words that Lonnie repeated to us with the careful precision of a man who wants to make sure the exact words are preserved. She said, "I believe you." She said, "The cattle do not lie." She said, 2 years without a calf lost on the south pasture when every other rancher in the county is losing calves is not luck, and it is not coincidence. She said, "Whatever is in those woods, it is doing work for us, and I do not need to understand it to see that it is real." That was the turning point for Lonnie. Not the encounter itself. Not the footage, not the cutting. The turning point was his wife saying, "I believe you," because it meant he was no longer carrying the knowledge alone. For 2.5 years, he had been processing the impossible by himself, with Travis as his only sounding board, and the isolation of that had been wearing him down in ways he did not recognize until the weight was shared. The relief he described when his wife accepted what he showed her was profound. His voice broke when he talked about it. A man who had spent 26 years maintaining composure in an environment where showing emotion was a liability, whose voice had been steady and controlled through descriptions of a 7.5-foot bipedal canid standing in his pasture and lying trapped in his fence and looking at him with amber eyes at 6 feet. That man's voice broke when he talked about his wife saying she believed him. The institutional silence around what Lonnie has documented on his property in LaFleur County follows the same pattern that every credible witness in this field has encountered. There is no mechanism for reporting it. There is no agency that will investigate it. There is no classification system that accommodates it. The Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation manages a database of predator sightings that has fields for black bear, coyote, bobcat, and mountain lion. There is no field for bipedal canid with territorial marking behavior and camera awareness consistent with high cognitive function. There is no form to fill out. There is no phone number to call. If Lonnie drove to the district wildlife office in McAlester and laid his evidence on a desk, the best outcome would be polite disbelief. The worst outcome would be a recommendation for a mental health evaluation. Either way, no investigation, no documentation, no institutional response. The Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation confirmed a breeding population of mountain lions in the southeastern portion of the state in 2015, after years of dismissing sighting reports from hunters and landowners in the Ouachita region. It took trail camera footage from multiple independent sources, physical evidence in the form of scat and tracks, and a dead lion hit by a car on a highway in McCurtain County before the department revised its position. If a known species with verified populations in surrounding states required years of accumulated evidence before the state would acknowledge it, what would it take for the state to acknowledge a species that does not exist in any zoological classification? The answer is that it would take evidence of a quality and quantity that no individual observer could produce alone. And even then, the institutional incentive to suppress rather than investigate would be overwhelming. Lonnie understood this. He understood it the way every credible witness in this field understands it, through the slow realization that the evidence they have collected is irrelevant to the institutions that should be evaluating it, because those institutions are not designed to receive it and not motivated to process it. The evidence sits in filing cabinets and on hard drives and in notebooks, accumulated by people who know what they saw and can prove it and cannot get anyone in a position of authority to look at it. In the fall of 2022, Lonnie had an experience that he described as the moment when the arrangement on his property shifted from coexistence to something he did not have a word for. His daughter brought his 2 grandchildren to the property for a week in August. The grandchildren were 8 and 5, a boy and a girl, and they spent the week doing what children do on a ranch in the Oklahoma countryside. They swam in the creek, they rode on the tractor, they chased chickens, they played in the yard, which on Lonnie's property meant the open grass between the house and the barn on the south side, the area that faced the south pasture and, beyond it, the fence line and the forest. On the 3rd day of the visit, Lonnie was walking the east side of the property, checking a water line that fed one of the stock tanks. He was about 400 yards from the house, out of sight of the yard behind a low ridge. The grandchildren were playing in the yard under their mother's supervision. Lonnie was not worried about them. The south pasture was fenced. The cattle were on the north side. The dogs were with the kids. There was nothing to worry about. He was walking back toward the house, along the east fence, when he noticed marks on a tree, a post oak, about 10 inches in diameter, standing inside his property about 30 yards from the east fence line. 4 parallel vertical gouges, fresh, the exposed wood still pale and wet with sap. The marks ran from about 4 feet to 6 feet. Lonnie had not found marks on his property in over 2.5 years, not since the creature had pulled its territorial indicators back to the national forest side of the south fence. The marks on his fence posts had stopped in late 2019. The marks on his trees had stopped. All the marking activity had been on the national forest side, in the buffer zone, refreshed periodically, but never crossing the fence line onto Lonnie's land. These marks were inside his property, east side, new territory. Lonnie had never found marks on the east side before. He photographed them, took a GPS reading, and then did what his instincts told him to do. He walked the east fence line looking for more. He found 7 more marked trees in the next hour, all on his property, all on the east side, all fresh. The marked trees formed a rough line that ran from the southeast corner of his property, where the south fence met the east fence, northward along the east boundary for about 300 yards. The line of marks did not continue past a point that was roughly even with the house. It stopped there. He stood at the northernmost marked tree and looked west toward the house. From that spot, he could see the yard. He could see the area where the grandchildren had been playing. The line of marked trees on the east side of his property formed a boundary that enclosed the yard and the south pasture and the area between the house and the south fence, a boundary that had not existed before his grandchildren arrived. Lonnie told us this part of the story with the most difficulty of anything we discussed across 6 hours of phone conversations. He said he sat down on the ground next to that tree and stayed there for a long time trying to understand what he was looking at. The creature had marked the east side of his property for the first time. The marks formed a line that enclosed the area where his grandchildren were playing. The marks had appeared within the last day or two, coinciding with the arrival of the children on the property. The creature was extending the buffer zone, expanding the protected perimeter, creating a new boundary on a side of the property that had never been marked before, a side that was previously open, and doing it at the precise time when small, vulnerable humans appeared on the property for the first time. The creature was protecting his grandchildren. That is the interpretation. Lonnie acknowledges that he cannot prove intent. He cannot prove that the marks on the east side were a response to the children's presence. It could have been a coincidence. It could have been a seasonal territorial expansion unrelated to human activity. It could have been a response to a different stimulus entirely. Another predator encroaching from the east. A change in prey distribution. Causes that had nothing to do with 2 small children playing in a yard 400 yards away. He cannot prove it was about the children. He can only describe what he observed. The marks appeared when the children arrived. They formed a perimeter that enclosed the area where the children played. They were on a side of the property that had never been marked before. And when the children left at the end of the week, and Lonnie walked the east fence line 2 weeks later, no new marks had appeared. The interpretation sits in Lonnie's chest, the way a stone sits in a creek bed. It does not move. It is part of the landscape of what he knows. The creature on the south side of his fence, the same creature or one of the creatures that he had been coexisting with for 4 years by then, had noticed the arrival of the children and had responded by expanding the territorial perimeter to include the area where they were present. It had, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, extended its protection to cover Lonnie's grandchildren. Travis, when Lonnie told him, was quiet for a long time. Then Travis said words that Lonnie carries with him. Travis said the Choctaw people had lived alongside those beings for thousands of years. Travis said there had to have been children in those Choctaw communities. Choctaw children playing in clearings near the forest edge. Choctaw families living at the boundary between the human world and the wild world. Travis said maybe this was what coexistence had always looked like. Maybe the beings and the people had always had this arrangement. The children were safe because the boundary was maintained, and the boundary was maintained because both sides understood the terms. Travis said maybe what Lonnie was experiencing was not new at all. Maybe it was ancient. Maybe it was the oldest version of this story, the one that existed before the treaties and the removals and the national forests and the trail cameras, the simple story of two kinds of intelligence, sharing a landscape and protecting each other's young. Lonnie lives on the property still. The arrangement persists. The south fence line is intact. The territorial marks in the national forest are refreshed every few weeks. The buffer zone holds. No predators enter from the south. The cattle graze without loss. The trail cameras record normal wildlife. The creature, or creatures, remain in the forest on the south side, present but unseen, audible on quiet nights, evidenced by the marks on the trees, enforcing a boundary that was drawn in wire and blood on a December night in 2019, when a retired corrections officer knelt in the dark and cut something free that he could have killed. Lonnie does not go into the forest south of his fence. He does not walk the ridgeline. He does not hike the national forest land that borders his property. He stays on his side. The creature stays on its side. The fence is the border. Both parties honor it. He does not talk about what happened except with Travis and his wife. He does not post on forums or social media. He does not attend the Bigfoot conferences that are held annually in Honobia, the small town in southeastern Oklahoma that has hosted a cryptid festival for years. He does not identify with the cryptid community, the researchers, the enthusiasts, the YouTube audience. He is a retired corrections officer who runs cattle on a small ranch in the Ouachita foothills, and the most significant thing that has ever happened to him on that land is something he can show to exactly 4 people without risking everything he has built in his life. The evidence is in his shop. The trail camera footage, the security camera recording from December 2019, the photographs, the fur samples, the GPS-plotted map, the dated notebook. If a wildlife biologist with institutional backing and the professional credibility to be taken seriously were to visit Lonnie's property and examine the evidence, what they would find is a body of documentation accumulated over 6 years by a man trained in incident recording and evidence preservation, supported by physical evidence in the form of territorial marks on trees and fence posts, fur samples, track impressions, and recorded footage showing a large bipedal figure with canine features on private property in LaFleur County, Oklahoma. But no biologist is coming. No institution is asking. The evidence sits in a filing cabinet in a shop on 160 acres at the edge of the Ouachita National Forest, kept by a man who knows what he has and knows that having it is meaningless within the system that should be evaluating it, because the system does not have a place for what he has found. The creatures are still in the forest south of his fence. They are still marking trees. They are still vocalizing on quiet nights from the ridgeline above the Kiamichi River drainage. They are still maintaining the buffer zone that emerged after December 2019. They are still doing what they have apparently been doing in the Ouachita Mountains for as long as the Choctaw people have been in the region, and likely longer. Living, marking territory, maintaining boundaries, avoiding humans when possible, tolerating them when necessary, and occasionally, when a man with wire cutters and the specific kind of courage that comes from 26 years of dealing with dangerous situations makes a decision that crosses the line between species, adjusting the terms of the arrangement to reflect a posture that is not quite gratitude and not quite alliance, but is close enough to both that the difference may not matter. Lonnie asked us not to specify the exact location of his property beyond the county. He said Lafleur County is big enough that the general description would not narrow it down to a specific parcel. He said there are thousands of acres of private land backing up to the Ouachita National Forest in the county, and his 160 acres is one small piece of a large landscape. He asked us not to describe the specific road or the distance from any named town or landmark. He said this was not about protecting himself. He said it was about protecting the arrangement. The arrangement works because nobody knows about it. The buffer zone holds because nobody is looking at it. The creatures maintain their territory because nobody is in it except Lonnie. And Lonnie has demonstrated, through an act that cost him nothing but courage and could have cost him everything, that he is not a threat. If people found out where the property was, they would come. Trophy hunters, curious hikers, researchers with trail cameras and recording equipment, media people looking for a story. They would push into the national forest on the south side and cross the buffer zone and walk into the creature's territory and force a confrontation that Lonnie does not believe would end well for anyone. The creatures have maintained an arrangement with one human who has demonstrated trustworthiness. They have not extended that arrangement to the human species as a whole. Lonnie is certain that a stranger with a rifle walking through the marked trees on the south side of his fence would receive a very different reception than the one Lonnie gets, and the consequences of that reception would be severe for the human and catastrophic for the creature. Once the human's body, or the human story, brought the full weight of institutional response down on a piece of national forest in southeastern Oklahoma, so the location stays vague. Lafleur County, the Ouachita Mountains, south of the Kiamichi River. That is enough for context. That is enough for anyone who knows this country to understand the terrain and the remoteness and the particular quality of wildness that the southeastern Oklahoma mountains possess. The precise coordinates, the property boundaries, the specific roads and landmarks, those stay with Lonnie. They are his side of the arrangement. They are the price of the treaty that he and the creature negotiated in the dark on a December night, kneeling on cold ground with wire cutters in one hand and a decision in his heart that took 10 seconds to make and will last the rest of his life. The fence is still there. Lonnie repaired the section he cut that night. New woven wire, new reinforcement strand, new post. The fence looks like every other section of woven wire on the south line, indistinguishable from the rest unless you know where to look. If you did look, if you crouched at the right spot and examined the wire closely, you might notice that the replacement section is slightly brighter than the surrounding wire, less weathered, newer. You might notice that the post is a different shade of cedar than the posts on either side. You might notice that the ground beneath the fence is slightly different, harder packed, disturbed, and resettled. You might wonder what happened there. But you would not know. Only Lonnie knows. And the creature on the other side of that fence, the one with the scar on its left leg where the wire cut deep before a man with cutters set it free, that creature knows too. The Ouachita Mountains run for 225 miles from central Arkansas into southeastern Oklahoma, covering terrain that has been inhabited for at least 12,000 years and forested for far longer. The ridges trend east to west. The hollows run north and south. The rivers cut through limestone and sandstone and shale in drainages that have been carving their channels since before the last ice age retreated. The forests are shortleaf pine on the south-facing slopes, post oak and blackjack oak on the ridges, white oak and hickory on the north-facing slopes, eastern red cedar in the draws and the fence rows, bald cypress in the lowest bottoms. It is old country, country that has held life in its folds for millennia, country that the Choctaw people knew before the Army of the United States marched them across the Mississippi and into a homeland that was already someone else's before they arrived. Something lives in that country that is not in the field guides, something that marks trees and neutralizes cameras and breaks deer necks and stands in pastures in the starlight and looks at humans with eyes that are amber and old and full of an intelligence that does not translate but communicates perfectly well across the boundary of a wire fence in the U side. Dark. Something that was there before the Choctaw arrived, before the French trappers came down from the Illinois country, before the Caddoan peoples built the mound complexes at Spiro, 12 miles north of Lonnie's property, over 1,000 years ago. Something that has been walking those ridges and marking those trees and maintaining those territories for longer than any human culture in the region can account for. It is still there. In the hollows south of the Kiamichi, in the ridgeline timber above the creek draws, In the national forest land that backs up to small ranches and farms and homesteads where people live at the edge of the wild, the way people have always lived at the edge of the wild, with one foot in the domestic world and the other in something vast and old and ungovernable. It is there, and it is watching, and it has been watching for a very long time. And if you are one of the people who live at that edge, who run cattle on ground that borders the national forest, who walk fence lines through timber that gets dark at midday and quiet in ways that quiet should not be, understand that the silence on the south side of your property might mean something. The absence of coyotes in your calving pasture might mean something. The marks on the trees that you attributed to bears might mean something different than what you assumed. And the thing that makes a sound on the ridgeline at 2 in the morning that you have never been able to identify might be part of an arrangement that is older than your deed and your fence and your family's presence on that land. An arrangement that works because both sides honor it. An arrangement that asks only one thing of you, which is the same thing it has asked of every human who has lived at the edge of its territory since the first people walked into these mountains at the end of the last ice age. Leave the forest alone, respect the boundary, and understand that you are not alone out there, even when everything in your experience tells you that you should be.